Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. These are the final lines of what is perhaps the single most popular, or at least well-known, poem in all of American literature. The poem is The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Frost wrote the poem in 1915 for his friend, the British writer Edward Thomas, intending to tease Thomas over the difficulty he would have in choosing a path when the pair would go out walking together, often regretting his choice in retrospect.
No, that's part of the mood of it is in it, that way. You wish you'd gone another way. As a matter of fact, I'm not quite that way. I'm thinking more of a friend I had that was always like that. Whichever way he went, he'd be melancholy about not having gone the other. He's doing that in heaven now.
There's some speculation that the poem played some part in Thomas's decision to enlist in World War I, where he was killed in the Battle of Arras in 1917. What I find interesting about this poem, beyond its incredible popularity, is that it seems to be one of the most commonly misunderstood poems. These final three lines are the most frequently quoted and form the foundation of one of the more common interpretations of this poem, but the two preceding lines of the stanza are usually omitted. So those three lines come after the following. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. And when you take this last stanza as a whole, the meaning appears completely different. But before we go into that, let's have a look at the whole poem. Presented as 4 stanzas, each with 5 lines, or 4 quintains, the poem's speaker describes walking through a wood and coming to a fork in the road. He stands for a long time trying to decide which path to take until eventually he chooses one, leaving the other road not taken, resolving to come back to the other path some other day, though he admits that he doubts he'll ever actually come back. The poem concludes with the speaker telling how in the future he'll tell a story of the two paths and how he chose to take the one less travelled by, and that, he will say, has made all the difference. These final lines are often taken to mean that the poem is a tribute to individualism and non-conformity. The speaker takes the less travelled road, he's his own person, and not following the crowd has had some positive effect on the course of his life. It's perhaps not surprising that this interpretation be so commonplace among Frost's largely American readership, coming from a Western culture that so ardently champions this kind of individualism. And in fact, this image of the road less travelled is so well worn in Western culture that it now exists outside of the poem entirely, often being used as shorthand for innovation or exceptionalism. It's even been adapted into countless stock images, no doubt dropped liberally into many a boardroom presentation. But if there was ever a barometer for completely missing the point, I think corporate sales pitches could be it. Because when you revisit the poem, it reveals another, almost totally opposed perspective. The speaker is merely deluding himself, rationalising the choice he made to avoid the pangs of regret that unsated curiosity about the other road might have brought. And certainly the poem's form doesn't do much to strengthen an argument for it as an anthem to nonconformity, conforming as it does to a strict A-B, A-A-B rhyme scheme. Right as the poem starts, the speaker tells how sorry he is that he can't travel both roads, and how in studying the two roads to weigh his decision, he can hardly find a difference between them. In fact, even in the moment he begins trying to form a justification, some reason to choose one over the other, telling himself that it has the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as soon as he does, he admits that really both roads seem equally travelled, and certainly that morning there's no obvious difference between them. In telling himself how he kept the first for another day, we see another self-deception, for he again immediately admits that he's not likely to ever come back. In taking one opportunity, he knows that he's necessarily sacrificing the chance to take a different opportunity. Perhaps Frost is telling us how it's human nature to wonder at what could have been. I mean, after all, the poem is titled The Road Not Taken, not The Road Less Travelled. The speaker's focus is more firmly on what he did not do than what he did. And indeed, in the poem, the speaker spends more time looking down the path he ultimately chooses not to take, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. He has a glimpse of how that road will start, but its destination is obscured to him. Frost appears to be drawing our attention to the fact that we can never know the long-term consequences of our decisions. We may see the impact our choices will make in the immediate future, but any further than that, and the consequences are unknown to us. Ultimately, the speaker takes the other road, thus condemning himself to a life wondering what exactly lay beyond that bend in the undergrowth. Once we acknowledge that in fact neither road has a legitimate claim to be the one less travelled by, the question becomes, why would the speaker lie about it? Certainly he knows it's a lie. We see the first line echoed again in the final stanza, but here the speaker hesitates, emphasising his lack of conviction, like he's about to say something untrue and it catches in his throat. And it should also be noted that this "and I" is another example of Frost going out of his way to conform, in this case to the rhyme scheme of the poem. But who is the speaker lying to? Himself? Perhaps he feels that the only way to live with the decisions he's made and quiet his restless mind is to create rationalizations for why he chose the path he did. Or perhaps he's lying to his audience, whoever he's telling the story to. Maybe he knows that he lives in a culture that celebrates individualism and that his justification for choosing one road over the other will mean his audience has a higher opinion of him than if he told them the truth, that he chose randomly. Or maybe he's not being untruthful at all. One could argue that his choice of path did in fact make all the difference. After all, we aren't told whether that difference is positive or negative. It could be neutral. Our lives boil down to a series of decisions, and what we choose to do now could affect where we end up years from now. You might argue that the speaker would have the exact same thing to say had he chosen the other path, and that he would be just as correct to do so. Your reading of these lines is going to depend on your interpretation, and may even change each time you look at the poem. Contrary to popular thought, this isn't a simple poem with one clear meaning, and you might even argue that no such poem exists. And while I may not agree with the reading of this poem as a simple encouragement of nonconformity, it also isn't the opposite of that. The speaker sees no difference between the roads. He doesn't know which is more popular, and so that simply can't factor into his decision-making. Perhaps Frost wants to tell us that while we shouldn't do the popular thing just because it's popular, we also shouldn't not do the popular thing just because it's popular. Non-conformity for the sake of non-conformity is just as ill-reasoned as conformity for the sake of conformity. Literary critic Franklin Trickier described The Road Not Taken as the best example in all of American poetry of a wolf in sheep's clothing. The journalist David Orr would go further. In his 2015 book, The Road Not Taken, Finding America in the poem Everyone Loves and Almost Everyone Gets Wrong, Orr sees the poem as maybe the best example in all of American culture of a wolf in sheep's clothing. As Orr sees it, the poem resembles the poet in this way. He describes Frost as the only major literary figure in American history with two distinct audiences. The first audience is small, consisting of poetry devotees and academics. To them, Frost is bleak, dark, complex, and manipulative, a genuine poet's poet. Then there is the other audience, Orr writes, the great mass of readers at all age levels who can conjure a few lines of The Road Not Taken and Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, and who think of Frost as quintessentially American. It's this audience who misidentify the poem as a simple paean to individualism, and perhaps this reputation of being quintessentially American is the reason. If Frost is the quintessential American, then surely he must have quintessential American values, including self-assured individualism. In taking an interpretation from a poem whose very lines to some extent contradict that interpretation, are these readers simply falling prey to confirmation bias? Do they see their own values reflected in Frost's work because they take such values to be self-evident? Or are they creating an interpretation in order to rationalize their worldview, just as the speaker does in the poem? I don't know. Maybe. I think Frost would want you to make up your own mind and leave a comment with your thoughts. And you should probably subscribe, lest you find yourself somewhere ages and ages hence, wondering about all the videos not watched.